This year's Ella Conference is appreciative of all of our sponsors. Our presenting sponsor, Gallagher. Our gold sponsors, the Arkansas SHRM chapters of NOARC and CARA, Windstream, Cross Gunner Witherspoon and Gauchus, and Wright Lindsay Jennings. Our silver sponsors, SFLIC, Consolidated Admin Services, Friday Eldridge and Clark, and the West Central Arkansas SHRM chapter. Our bronze sponsors, First Staff and the Human Resources team.
Hello, I'm MichelleK ShelbyH with Wright Lindsay and Jennings, part of our employment team. I'm here with ShelbyH, who is also part of our employment team. And our mission today is to provide a legislative update. A few months ago, I would not have expected that this would be such a COVID-focused update, but that's where we are. And so while there were a number of employment-related bills introduced during the spring session, most of the ones that passed and that we think are relevant enough to talk with you guys about are COVID-related. One exception is there was an amendment passed to the law enacted a couple years ago about firearms that permits employees to have firearms in the parking lot of your business. Initially, the act said it had to be locked up. So the car had to be locked and the gun had to be in a locked container. That has been amended now. So it just has to be in a locked car. And so if you have a policy that prohibits employees from bringing firearms to work, you've got to carve out the parking lot, and you probably need to update your policy because the ones we were writing a couple of years ago tracked the statute. So that we're working with clients to make a slight revision to that. But otherwise, we're here to talk about pandemic-related laws, both passed in Arkansas and at the federal level, regulations and guidance from OSHA and CDC primarily. So as you know, Arkansas is experiencing a Delta surge. I think it's the third surge, but we are tracking numbers as high as we've seen. I looked at Johns Hopkins today, and the 7-day average was 1,800 cases, whereas yesterday was well over 2,000. So the trend is, as you all know, in this direction. As of August 20th, when we ran these numbers, 51% of Arkansans had received one dose of the vaccine and just under 40% fully vaccinated. So much lower than some of the other states that are seeing surges. So as we go through this new wave of the pandemic, it's really important for businesses to reevaluate their COVID plans and policies, especially in light of several of the laws that were enacted here in Arkansas in the spring. So I'm gonna turn it over to Shelby to talk about the first one of those.
So in this latest legislative session, the Arkansas legislature passed 894 bills. As Michelle said, some of those affected employers, but the most of note and the most relevant new laws that are affecting businesses and employers in Arkansas right now mostly relate with COVID-19. The first act that is you've probably seen a lot in the news lately, is Act 1002, which is the face mask mandate. And in this law, the legislature took the ability of local, state, and city governments and agencies to enact face mask requirements. The legislature did reserve the right to itself enact the mandatory face mask requirement, but local, state, and city officials are not allowed to create their own face mask requirements in their buildings. As I said, you may have seen this in the news because there's been a lot of challenge and pushback to this law. Starting at the beginning of August, Governor Hutchinson called a special session of the Arkansas legislature because of the rise that we're seeing in cases due to the Delta variant. And he called a special session with the hopes of modifying that ban on face mask mandates. However, after a week of the special session, no changes to that law were made by the legislature itself. However, on the last day of that special session, we got a preliminary injunction from Pulaski County Circuit Judge Tim Fox. That's in a case where the Little Rock School District and Marion School Districts challenged the bill. And Judge Fox ruled that there should be an injunction on it as it goes through the court system because it violates the Arkansas Constitution. So in response to this preliminary injunction, about 60 local school districts and charter schools created face mask mandates for their students and teachers. And we've also seen some city governments, such as the city of Little Rock, also reenact their face mask mandates in city buildings. Now, what impact does this have on our businesses? There's no effect on private businesses with this law. The bill itself never touched private businesses, healthcare facilities, or facilities that are run by the Division of Youth Services or the Arkansas Department of Human Services. So private employers can require face masks for their employees. They can require them for patrons that come into their business premises. And healthcare facilities can as well. However, our local and state governments, which includes our public schools, may again be banned from requiring the masks, depending on what happens with this lawsuit that's pending before Judge Fox or other lawsuits that may arise. So that's something that we will be keeping an eye on to see how that plays out and how it may affect our schools and our public government buildings. Another law that the legislature passed is Act 977, and that touches on vaccine mandates. So this law, what it does is it prohibits, again, state and local government officials from mandating or coercing any individual to take the COVID-19 vaccine for purposes of education, employment, or entry of services. It provides a process where state-owned or controlled medical facilities can be granted an exception so that they could require the vaccine, but we haven't seen any of the hospitals get that exception yet, so that's something that may happen. The act does not, again, it does not affect private employers from requiring or incentivizing the COVID-19 vaccine. So right now, private employers can require their employees to be vaccinated. However, in August, one of the state senators introduced a new piece of legislation, and that bill would prohibit private employers from also requiring their employees from getting the COVID-19 vaccine, and it would also prohibit them from requiring their employees to disclose their vaccination status. So employers would not be able to ask their employees who has or has not been vaccinated and would not be able to require employees to be vaccinated. There would also be liability for incentivizing the vaccine for employees. In August, the legislators approved a study of that bill. The legislator is currently in a recess right now, but they do reconvene this fall to work on redistricting. So it's not yet clear when that bill will be taken up or what the status of that will be, but it'll be very important for private employers to keep an eye on that, and it may affect how we address the COVID-19 vaccines in the workplace.
So, agree with Shelby, we will be keeping a close eye on that bill once the legislature is back in session. But for now, we are living in a world where you as a private employer can mandate vaccines. And we are seeing that trend. I think in our state, Walmart and Tyson were the first I heard about, other than some healthcare. Mercy was out there early. They're headquartered in Missouri. And so, I mean, that is the trend. We're seeing small businesses doing it here in the last couple of weeks in particular. And so companies who make that decision to mandate vaccination have to keep in mind that if an individual can't be vaccinated because of a disability or a sincerely held religious belief, you've got to, on a case-by-case basis, work through the accommodations analysis that I know y'all are very familiar with. But I want to spend a little time talking about how that accommodations interactive process looks in the context of vaccines, because we are getting a lot of questions. So I think this is probably top of mind for some of y'all. So let's start with requests for exemptions. I call it exemptions because essentially it's a mandate and they're asking to be exempt. That's so I'll call it that sometimes. And so let's start with disability-based requests to be exempted from a vaccine mandate at your company. So the ADA, as you know, says a company's got to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified individuals with disabilities, unless the company can prove it would pose a direct threat to the health or safety of others or an undue hardship to the company. And so first, let me say, like with any disability accommodation, you can request medical documentation. So that there's nothing different about that rule in the vaccine realm. And so if the documentation shows that the employee cannot receive the vaccine because of a medical condition that would constitute a disability, and you know we tend to we just assume the medical condition is a disability generally. And so then the company's got to assess whether the unvaccinated employee being in the workplace poses a direct threat to the health and safety of others. That's the analysis. And I mentioned it's case by case, or EEOC calls it individualized assessment. And I would highly recommend, you're probably very familiar with it at this point, but the EEOC's COVID page, or pages, it just goes on and on because it has grown over the last 18 months. But there is a very long section on vaccines. It's section K. And I would recommend that to you, but you know, they detail the kinds of factors that are relevant to the direct threat analysis. And a couple of the main ones in my mind are, what is the employee's position? What's the nature of their work? How much do they interact with coworkers when they're in the office, the physical space? How much do they interact with the public, if any? And then also the level of community spread is a factor that the EEOC lists as something you should consider in analyzing direct threat. Now, if you go to the CDC's I think it is CDC website, to look at the community spread across the country, you all have probably seen this map because it seems like it's all over the place, but it is almost entirely at high level. It's red. There's these little pockets in the middle of the country that are a beautiful blue that we can all envy, but pretty much everywhere currently the level of spread is such that, you know, that's going to be a relevant consideration. And so if you conclude after doing that individualized assessment of this employee's job and the work they do that it would pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others to have them in the workplace, you're not done. because the next stage in the analysis is, well, can we make other accommodations, implement other safety precautions that would sufficiently reduce the risk to others and the employee's own safety. And that can, I have one client who has a couple of folks, they have mandated vaccines, they have a couple of folks who meet the test for an exemption, they cannot work remotely, so they have to wear N95 wherever they go during the entire workday. And so you've got to go through that analysis, and if there is no accommodation that would sufficiently reduce the risk to others of this employee being unvaccinated, then you're still not done, because you've got to analyze the ability to work remote, and you probably in reality thought about that earlier on in the process. And if this is not an employee who can work remote, like a lot of the questions I'm getting are people who work in a medical clinic and they're involved in patient care, then you have to look at leave. That's always, if there's no accommodation that would allow somebody to be at work and do the essential functions of their job, then we always have to look at a leave of absence. So you got to be flexible, you got to be thorough, document the analysis, and just take each one on a case-by-case basis. Some people can do their job remotely, and that's already been established in many cases early in the pandemic. So the other area where you may have to grant someone an exemption from a vaccine mandate is sincerely held religious belief. So that's Title VII, and it is a slightly different analysis. It is a little easier for a company, because there you have to provide the accommodation unless it would present an undue hardship. That is a little bit of an easier standard to meet under Title VII than under ADA. And so, just keep that in your mind if you find that it's in a gray area, for example. It may tip the scale one way or the other depending on whether it's disability or religion. And so what undue hardship means under Title VII when we're looking at religious-based requests for exemption to a vaccine mandate is, would the accommodation cause more than a de minimis cost or burden on the company's business operations? And so we get a lot of questions about, is this request really based on a sincerely held religious belief? I've never heard of this faith or religious belief. And generally, the guidance is that companies should assume that it is, because the definition of religion is quite broad under Title VII, and it protects beliefs and practices and observances that most people may not be familiar with. I will say, but I'm getting ahead of myself. If the company has an objective basis for questioning the sincerity of the claimed reason for the exemption, it can ask for additional documentation. I would be careful there. For example, I've seen some, this is not in the vaccine context, but where it was a request for to be absent on a Jewish holiday, and they asked for a note from the rabbi. We're not doing that. What I have seen here in the last couple of weeks is some companies are being overwhelmed, who have implemented mandates, vaccine mandates, are being overwhelmed by requests for exemption based on religion. And so I have seen some forms that are being developed that ask the employee to specify the component of the vaccine that is contrary to the sincerely held religious belief. And so if you get in that position, and you're thinking about you're getting you have mandated vaccines, you're getting these requests for exemptions, and you think you might like to develop maybe a more robust form, I would just say, you know, talk to a lawyer, but that may, I'm seeing it done. I will say that. Okay, Shelby, our next statute.
Our next statute is Act 1030, and that deals with vaccine passports. And states are handling our vaccine passports in a lot of different ways, but the law that was passed by our legislature prohibits state and local officials and agencies from requiring vaccine purposes for any purpose. That includes for conditioning entry into a space, travel, education, or receiving services. The issue with this bill is that it's very ambiguous as to whether it also applies to private businesses. The way that it's written, it's just very unclear as to just how far this bill reaches. It also does not include any exceptions for healthcare facilities or nursing homes, and it seems to stretch into perpetuity, even if the vaccines are fully approved by the FDA, just like we saw this week. The Pfizer vaccine was fully approved. So the reach of this vaccine passport prohibition is just pretty unclear at this point. And we're seeing that as well from our state politicians. One of the sponsors of the act, State Senator Trent Garner, he has stated that the law does apply to private businesses. Governor Hutchinson, on the other hand, has stated that it does not. So we're just kind of at a standstill trying to figure out how far does this apply and how can private businesses, what can they do when they have an event? Can they require proof of vaccination? So despite this ambiguous language, we're seeing some venues and some businesses around the state go ahead and require proof of vaccination or a recent negative COVID test for events that they're hosting this fall. Just in the news the past couple of weeks, the Walmart AMP up in Northwest Arkansas has stated that they will require either proof of vaccination or a negative COVID test, and the Arkansas Symphony Orchestra has said that they will require the same for their events that are coming up. We are getting this question frequently from clients, whether or not they can require these things for events that they're hosting soon. And unfortunately, the advice right now is that it's a kind of a game of wait and see. Because of the ambiguity, this is kind of ripe for some sort of legal challenge. And it's likely that we'll see some sort of lawsuit challenging a company's requirement to show proof of the vaccine. We're not aware of any lawsuit like that has been filed yet, but it's something that we're keeping a close eye on and that businesses should also be keeping a close eye on. Hopefully, if something does occur, we will at least get more clarification on how far the law reaches and how businesses can, how they can go forward with their events. So, yeah, the next one is Michelle.
Okay. This is just a side note on vaccine passports. So I was in New Orleans last week, the day that they started enforcement of their local law requiring proof of vaccination or a negative test to enter a restaurant or bar. And it was comforting to be asked. They're accepting it on the phone, so it's, you know, I had to finally learn how to create a favorites album in my phone so that I could easily get to my proof of vaccination. And I was comforted until I realized they were not also asking for my ID. So I could have had anyone's vaccination card on my phone, but I've been told that they're a week in now and that it's tightening up. And so people are being asked for their ID along, and that, you know, but businesses are, I suspect, having to hire additional staff because there is someone at the door. At many restaurants, you know, like Cafe Beignet does not normally have a greeter or a host position, and they're having to have somebody at the door to check this. So it'll be interesting. Like Shelby said, we haven't seen a lot of that in Arkansas yet, but the statute is ambiguous, and I bet we start to see more of it. So, okay, switching gears. So, Act 559 was also passed. It's the Civil Liability Protection law, and so this law protects businesses from civil liability and tort claims relating to spread of COVID-19 in the workplace or during activities managed by the business, unless it was, now there's no protection for intentional, reckless, willful conduct. But really, you know, this is a very short statute, and under the plain language of the law, a business is protected from liability for COVID-related, you know, transmissions in the workplace as long as it was acting in good faith while attempting to comply with governmental health and safety directives. Good faith, attempting. You don't have to get an A+, is what I take that to mean. The statute does specific, when it says complying with governmental and health and safety directives, it specifically mentions ADH, Arkansas Department of Health, and CDC. And you know, the CDC is guidelines, so I can see some arguments being made about that. But what I take from this statute is, it is really, this is just another reason why it's really important for your company in terms of managing your risk to keep up with the latest recommendations and do whatever you can to comply with them, so that you could establish good faith if you had a tort claim related to COVID-19. And I mean, it sounds kind of easy to comply with state and federal guidelines, but it's so fluid, as we've seen. I don't think it really is easy. I think it takes some work. And so, for example, remember May and June? It was such a wonderful time, and the CDC said that fully vaccinated people didn't have to wear a mask. And then in late July, when it became clear that fully vaccinated people were not only getting the Delta variant, but transmitting it, and so infecting others, CDC changes, you know, they reverse course, and now they are recommending everyone in your workplace be masked, at least, you know, in common areas and when you're around others. And this month, I mean, I think it was like August 13th, OSHA updates all their guidance. And I don't know if y'all have had a chance to look at that yet, but essentially it's tracking the updated CDC guidance. And so some things that OSHA is now recommending is, and again, there's some benefit to your company if you're taking steps in good faith to follow these guidelines. So fully vaccinated workers in areas of substantial or high community transmission, all of Arkansas, should wear masks in order to protect unvaccinated coworkers. Fully vaccinated people who have close contact with someone with COVID-19 need to wear masks for up to 14 days unless they get a negative test. We've had people in our office having to, you know, go through that. OSHA says employers should consider working with local public health authorities to provide vaccinations for unvaccinated workers. You've probably seen or heard about some vaccination clinics in workplaces. And then also, OSHA recommends that employers consider adopting policies that require worker to either get vaccinated or get regular tests. And that's definitely a trend too. I mean, while we're seeing more vaccine mandates in the last few weeks, what I'm probably seeing the most of is that kind of hybrid. So either you get a vaccine and provide proof of vaccination, or you're going to have to get daily tests, with the idea being that it's annoying to get that test once a week, and maybe some folks who were otherwise reluctant will get the vaccine rather than have to follow that step. One other thing I wanted to mention about OSHA that is fairly new and does not apply to everyone, but in June they released an emergency temporary standard that applies to businesses that provide healthcare services unless they meet an exemption. And if that might be you, if you might be covered by this OSHA emergency temporary standard and you haven't looked at it, make that a priority, because for covered settings, so workplace settings that are covered, so you don't meet any of the exemptions, it mandates paid leave when the employee is removed from the workplace because of COVID-related reasons. And it mandates implementation of a written COVID plan and a designated COVID safety coordinator. So OSHA is now mandating some things that, I mean, this is not required of anybody unless you're covered by this ETS, but I think I'm seeing medical clinics get wind of this and have to make changes, some pretty substantial changes, including the paid leave. You know, we all worked through the Families First paid leave issues last year, and many maybe thought that was behind us, but if you work in a healthcare setting, it may not be. Okay, so we have covered the statutes that we wanted to talk about that were passed here in Arkansas in the spring, but it is a lot, and you know, we talked about that fluidity, so we really wanted to spend some time here as kind of our last topic to let's just go through what employers need to be doing when you're responding to these new laws and the impact of the Delta surge. So first of all, encourage vaccination. It remains the best way to prevent serious illness and keep people out of the hospital, and you know, keep your business running successfully and profitably. So SHRM has said that 62% of employers have reported offering time off for vaccination, and 58% offered time off for side effects of vaccination. And so there are those type of incentives to encourage it. And then according to SHRM, 10% of employers have offered financial incentives, which are usually under $100. I heard today that Delta so the $100 rate or the time off is the carrot, but Delta is going a different route now that Pfizer has been fully approved, and if you're on Delta's insurance and you don't get vaccinated, you're getting charged, I think it's $200 a month. So I thought that was a new one to me today. And then we've already talked about, but I'll just mention it again, that recent trend of either mandate the vaccine or require the regular testing, which does seem in a couple of workplaces I'm working with to have driven those vaccination numbers up a little bit. And then you gotta decide what you're gonna do about your mask policy, because you know, some businesses have had their masks were mandated and then they weren't, and then it's a hard decision to go back. But keep in mind that you've got CDC and OSHA now recommending that fully vaccinated people be masked at work, at least in indoor spaces, until the numbers improve. because now it does have that caveat in areas of substantial or high transmission. But for the foreseeable future, I think that's where we are in the red zone. And another thing that we're seeing with respect to vaccinations and masks that employers are doing, it's sort of limiting the benefits of employment that are available to unvaccinated workers by restricting their access to certain common areas like a cafeteria or a gym, where it's difficult or impossible in the case of the cafeteria to wear masks. And we do expect mask mandates to continue to increase as these numbers continue to surge. Something you have been doing, I am sure, since the beginning of the pandemic is navigating the kind of challenging issue of communicating about exposure. So employee hopefully tells you they tested positive for COVID-19. We found they do not always, but we find out by other ways. Hello, Facebook. But when you learn that an employee has tested positive for COVID-19, you still need to be doing the contact tracing and communicating with exposed workers while protecting the confidentiality of the person involved. If they want to tell everyone on the floor that they tested positive for COVID-19, that is fine. But we just can't have people hearing about it from the HR department. You can tell somebody they've been exposed without telling them by whom. And y'all probably don't need to hear that again because you've been doing it for 18 months. But we just wanted to cover everything that we're having to keep track of at one time. Shelby?
Another thing that it will be really beneficial to start having conversations and discussing is if the need does arise to transition to some sort of work from home or remote policy, what that will look like. A lot of us were caught off guard at the beginning of the pandemic, and there was a lot of scrambling and thinking on our feet when it came to working from home, and we were able to work through those kinks. But the more that your business can start having those preemptive conversations in case the need does arise, it will just make that transition smoother than it was when it's at the last minute and not as well thought out. So start thinking about what is the threshold for sending employees back home, or some employees? Is it a certain level of cases in your community? Is it a spread in your workplace? But start to think about when and how would your employees start to work from home again? And then what policies need to be in place for employees that are working at home? Not only that, but think about the infrastructure that you would need if we did transition back to a large majority of our workforce working remotely. If you had issues the last year with things like connecting remotely, any other technology, communication, or protecting your company's data and technology safety, it's really beneficial to start thinking about that now, and how can you improve those infrastructures in your company so that if we are forced to go back and work from home again, that those will be in place and ready to go. It is also worth training your employees and making sure that they're up to date on work from home policies, and also how they can best protect company data. What are the best practices for them working at home, and so that they can do that smoothly, and then also protect the information within your company. Another thing that is important to think about is, are your policies up to date with any remote work or other COVID-related policies? So like Michelle said, very important to keep those updated with the latest CDC, Arkansas Department of Health guidelines, And it's also very important that your written policy actually matches the practice of your company. And that is the best way to make sure that you're afforded that protection of the Civil Liability Protection Act that Michelle discussed, and to make sure that you're protected. It's very important that, that your practices and your written policies match up. And we'll turn it back over. Oh, got a little bit more. Just kidding. Just some examples of written policies that you may want to either make sure that you have written down or make sure that they are up to date and revised are procedures for requesting how to work remotely, required job duties and expectations for working at home, any employee monitoring practices. So if you're monitoring your employees' productivity, whether they're actually at their computer during work hours, things like that, it's important to communicate that to employees on the front end. What is the workspace and work equipment for your employees working from home? Can they work from a friend's house? Can they work from the beach? Do they have to be at their house? How do they communicate where they're at? Data security practices, timekeeping, prohibited contacts, such as we've seen cases where online harassment is prevalent in the workplace just as much as harassment that happens in person. On-the-job injuries, I know that when people were working from home, there were a couple of workers' compensation claims for employees that were injured in their kitchen, but on the workday. So what does that look like? And then reasonable accommodations and leave requests, as we talked about. And it's important that these policies are objective and for a legitimate business purpose, so that you protect yourself from any sort of discrimination claims when you're deciding who can work from home, how and when, and that they're consistent across your workforce. Now I'll turn it back over to Michelle.
All right, so that about covers it. In closing, we just say, hang in there, keep working hard to stay current like you've been doing for a year and a half. It is not easy. And think about, there's some particularly thorny areas where you might want to get advice of counsel. The ones that stand out to me and that we're hearing the most questions are vaccine mandate exemptions and this new OSHA emergency temporary standard that applies in the healthcare setting. Those are pretty complicated, but hang in there. We're doing it with you, trying to keep current. So thank you very much.
Thank you.